Hello everybody, my name is Anna Zachary. I head up the Education Unit at Policy Exchange. Thank you so much for coming here today. I'm actually just here to flag up the fact that we published a report about a month ago called Simply Learning, which is focused on skills. So if you haven't seen it and would like a copy, please do let me know and we can supply you with one. We've actually just run out of our pile at the back. To kick us off today, I'm delighted to introduce a very fabulous chairman, David Turner, who is the education correspondent for the Financial Times. I'm sure many of you are pestered by him regularly on the telephone and know him already.
Maybe nicely.
David.
Hello there. Don't worry, I'm not going to make a long speech. It's not in the journalist's nature, I think. We restrict ourselves to 450-word statements. Welcome to the debate on skills. We're going to concentrate on a few specific areas, which I'll just briefly introduce. But also, actually, what would be quite nice would be if each speaker during a speech could also address the standard question that you probably always get asked, which is if you were skills minister or skills secretary or business secretary or whoever it will be in a year's time, as the department keeps changing, what's the single thing that you would change about the skills system that you would most want to change? But aside from that, we look at a few specific points we're going to look at today. One quite important one is the issue of how the skills system can escape from its focus on qualifications. I think the government's been accused quite a lot of what I've heard called credentialism, that there's obsession with meeting the LEETs targets that a certain number of people reach a certain skills level, and there's an argument made that this has a negative impact on the value of qualifications. For example, a lot of research, and I think research as the Wolf has done, shows quite low returns and sometimes negative returns to some low-level vocational qualifications, which implies that perhaps we're too obsessed with pieces of paper and certificates at the expense of common sense qualifications, perhaps. And another point is the issue of whether it should be government should be concentrated on paying employers to train staff or routing more government funding through the individual. I suppose the argument for paying employers is the usual argument that business knows what's best, and the argument against that, I suppose, or one of them, is that employers know that their employees might not stay in the job for more than a couple of years, and they might be disincentivized from training them up for long-term qualifications, so there's a market failure argument that's used often. The third of the 4 points is how can we maximise the potential of the sometimes much abused sector skills councils. We have here the head of a sector skills council, which is possibly the only sector skills council I know that gets unmitigated praise from business, which is probably why you've been invited. And one argument for sector skills councils is that they should be concentrating on the old sticking to your knitting argument. In other words, looking at just which qualifications are appropriate for the sector rather than doing a mapping of future demand and so on the argument that other people are doing that, and that the market will sort that out itself. And the final point, before I let Phil speak, I see he's impatient to talk, is, being an MP, is what the future should be for apprenticeships. That some people have argued we should have even more high-level apprenticeships than we have now, more level 4, even level 5 apprenticeships, almost a return to the medieval masters at guilds who do 10 years training, or 10 years work and training to get a very high-level, technical level of skill. Some people have argued that level 2 apprenticeships are not really apprenticeships, really. They've been renamed, they're not particularly useful, and that apprenticeships have suffered from a brand dilution for that reason. So I'm sure that Phil will address all these questions and more, but he has to do so in 5 minutes, so he'll probably talk very fast. So Phil with us.
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed. And that's the first I knew of the agenda for today, so we'll do our very best to follow. Can I start by saying that I'm not a non-domiciled taxpayer, so we move on and say what a pleasure it is to meet a group of people who are interested in skills rather than homeopathy. But that's been a problem over the last few weeks. Can I start by saying that none of the political parties in the run for this general election are even beginning to address the issue of skills. School budgets are protected by all the major parties. Higher education is taking a relatively small hit, despite the fact that it is a huge consumer of public resources. Health and police are protected. And I think the starting point for our debate is what is left. And if there's going to be savage cuts, however one wants to describe it, of perhaps, in terms of the IFS predictions of somewhere between 12.9 and 25% in certain areas of the budget, how's that going to impact on skills? And that's a fundamental question, which I think we need to address today. So my questions for the debate are that, first of all, are we using existing resources effectively? And that comes back to many of the questions that were raised. Is the current skills delivery mechanism fit for purpose? Thirdly, do government priorities for skills match the needs of UK PLC, which is a fundamental issue? And fourthly, can we make a case for the protection of skills and skills budgets in the face of fierce public sector cuts? And my answer to all those is no, 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 and no. Or no at present for the last one, how do we protect skills funding? Can I start also by saying it isn't a question of money. There is no doubt that there has more money gone into this area over the past 10 years, and particularly over the past 2 comprehensive spending reviews, than by any other government in the history of skills funding. And it is important to state that. The Adult Skills Agency is spending 4.8 billion, Adult HE spending 13 billion, excluding research, Job Centre Plus spending 7.3 billion, of which 3.5 billion is on employment programmes, including skills. So arguably there is £22 billion worth of expenditure there to be able to be used in the broader skills area. And the coordination, however, between these budget heads is absolutely woeful. The domination of the HE sector, particularly student support, means that level 2-3 skills and vocational level 4 skills, which are often undertaken by part-time students, are totally neglected in many, many areas. The voice of industry, led by Sector Skills Council, which I believe have been an abject failure, are all government appointed. They are weak generally, and the skills system is dominated by big players with time to give. So there's an area, you can see where my agenda's going. And perhaps, please don't take it personally.
Just dying to reply.
And despite the best efforts of UKCS, the plethora of organisations delivering skills is growing rather than diminishing. And every new pot of money and the new 6 months guarantee and guarantees for 16 to 24-year-olds breeds a plethora of new organisations and new providers, ticking yet more boxes and creaming off yet more resources. I'm bitter. So let me begin my contentious contribution by saying that an incoming government must first of all rationalise an incomprehensible skills system. And if it doesn't deserve to be funded. It must secondly recognise that higher education at undergraduate level is significantly about providing skills and the acquisition of skills, and as such, combining the teaching elements of HEFCE with the Skills Funding Agency would enable a level playing field between FE, HE and adult skills, and it would concentrate minds more than it does at the moment, creating a new focus for post-18 education and skills. Next, we must recognise that the key task of an incoming government, a Liberal Democrat government, would be to get the nation back at work. Given the polls, anything could happen. And skills are very much at the heart of that agenda. So linking the Skills Funding Agency with Job Centre Plus and create a single agency for work and skills is absolutely essential. The idea that you have these 2 huge budgets who are working in silos, often against each other, is utterly ludicrous. Empower individuals with a more effective individual skills account, allowing them to use their virtual credits directly with employers, colleges and universities. Unless we empower the individual to take a huge stake in their own skills development, then we will miss out. And if we want to see the skills agenda continuing to be relevant, it has to be an integral part of every business, not done to businesses by sector skills councils or somebody else, but by businesses themselves. And I want to see, as the new minister, every individual of working age and every government programme do an audit of what is happening in terms of skills, which does mean that for companies, reporting about their skills development in their annual report would be mandatory. It would also enable them to receive tax credits for training, so incentivising companies. And yes, there's some deadweight cost to that, but if we really want to put business at the heart of an emerging skills agenda with a post-recession 21st century economy, we really have to trust more employers and more individuals about developing those skills, rather than believing that the state at the centre can actually deal with that. And finally, as a way of redressing the balance, I have been really pleased with the emphasis that this government has placed on skills. There is no government has given a greater attention to it. And the general buy-in by all political parties, despite an unprecedented emphasis in terms of other directions. Leach was brilliant. UKCS's annual report just a year ago in May was absolutely brilliant. But I ask all of you, has a single significant thing emerged as a result of those two great pieces of work? What has actually happened on the ground in delivering it? We have, as we've mentioned, the emphasis on qualifications as a proxy to skills continues to dominate this whole agenda. It allows what can be measured, mentality that in turn drives mediocrity rather than excellence. And if you want an example of some evidence to prove that, look at Train to Gain. Look at the effect that £1 billion budget has actually had on the ground. And I tell you that I rest my case.
Thank you very much. Unsurprisingly, Sector Skills Council's got a couple of jibes in there, but Diana will have a chance to respond soon. And next, Alison Wolfe, who's Professor of Public Sector Management at King's College London, and noted economist who looks at skills.
Right, well, I agreed with about half of what Phil said and disagreed strongly with the other half, so that should get us going. And I'd like to start by saying that I actually hate the fact that I'm up here talking about skills. I think I should not be talking about skills, I think I should be talking about education. And one of the things that has happened in the last 30 years is that the divide that has opened up is between the advantaged middle classes and the bright 18-year-olds who go into higher education who are allowed to have an education, and everybody else who gets skills. So we don't have further education anymore, we don't have adult education anymore, we have skills. And that change, that terrible dividing off of education for the advantaged and skills for the hoi polloi, that actually goes along with the growth of the qualification targets, the determination of government, and it was governments, it started at the time of the NVQ introduction under the Tories, but it's redoubled in the last 30 years. It went along with targets, it went along with an obsession with qualifications, and underlying both of those was the belief that central government actually knew what the economy needed, could drive it from the centre, could do it by designing qualifications, funding qualifications, and deciding how many of each that it needed. And in terms of how do we get away from that, we get away from it very, very simply. We get away from it by just putting not virtual credits, but credits in people's hands. Not virtual learning accounts, but real learning accounts. And if I were coming into office tomorrow, that would be the first thing I would do. I would actually set up proper accounts for individuals. That, in and of itself, would immediately mean that the obsession with qualifications vanished. Because instead of paying people to deliver qualifications, you give people money, and if qualifications is what they want, that's what they can buy. If they don't want qualifications, if, like many of us in this room, I suspect, they want at some point to go off and increase particular skills or get education, which is often the most vocationally relevant thing you can do, they can do it. I want to really push this point about education, not skills, for two reasons. First is because I don't think that any system is just about gearing up today's workforce in a narrow sense. But it's also much more generally, because we don't know what tomorrow will bring, because we don't know where our lives will go, the vocationally most useful thing you can do, actually, is to get a broad education. And this idea that we can specify exactly what the economy needs, tie it down through qualifications, build a vast bureaucracy which follows immediately from qualification targets, is what has got us into the mess we're in already. And with respect to Phil, I agree utterly that train to gain has been a terrible mistake and a terrible waste of money. I'm stunned that you think Leach was wonderful. Leach is all targets. Leach in the same paragraph says, we don't know what the future will bring, therefore we need several 100,000 of this particular sort of qualification. Two other quick points. I don't think it is the job of the taxpayer to subsidise employers to do what they're doing already. There is absolutely no evidence, either theoretical or indeed practical, you can find for this. There's nothing that says that you should be subsidising employers to the detriment of new entrants and their competitors. And actually no empirical evidence that there is a shortage of relevant training because people are afraid that their employees will get poached. I think it's absolutely abominable that the whole thirst for qualifications has led us into a situation where we are encouraging large companies to stick certificates on their initial training and then get paid by the taxpayer, by us, to deliver that initial training. And the fact that some of the biggest companies in the land are making a profit on this just makes it even worse. The one area where there is an actual need to pay employers is in terms of apprenticeship, because that's where they're actually performing an educational function. There's absolutely no other reason to do it. So in terms of what should we be doing, let me just reiterate this point. What we should be doing is very simple. We should be sweeping away the whole apparatus that follows from targets, from a belief that the central government can decide what the economy needs tomorrow, from a determination to send that down the way via all these endlessly morphing and growing quangos and hurdles, and actually go with what all the evidence tells us is true, the fact that individuals are much better able to decide what is good for them than anybody else is. And they should decide whether what they want is a qualification or not.
Thank you very much. And now Anna Fazakli, Head of Education at Policy Exchange, who will put a fairly free market point of view.
I'm going to reiterate the point that Alison made, which is that I think it's truly unbelievable that Phil Willis, who's a very sensible man, has just described the Leach report as incredible. Just a simple point to kick us off. I know Leach doesn't do simplicity, but Leach promised us a simplified and demand-led system. And what we have now is, the exact opposite. So Phil, I think really you need to erase that from the speech if you give it somewhere else in the near future. I want to touch, we've talked a lot about qualifications, but qualifications are absolutely central to what is going on with the skills system, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about them. One of the major reasons that we don't have a simplified and demand-led system is Leach and also the government's adherence to the quite attractive notion that qualifications are a terribly neat proxy for the level of skills in a country. Following this tidy logic, all that we need to do is drive up the UK's qualifications profile to bring it level with competitors' countries, and our training needs will be completely solved and our productivity will rocket. This focus on qualifications has led to a system which responds not to demand from employers or from individuals, but to a government desire for tangible results. So if I were minister for a day, I don't actually want to be minister for a day, but if I were, the first thing that I would do would be to completely scrap the government's national qualifications targets, which are the centre of all of the problems when it comes to skills. Train to Gain purports to be a response to market failure. Alison thinks that market failure isn't happening. I'm more inclined to believe that there probably is a need for employer subsidy, for subsidising employer training. However, of course, we don't want to subsidise training that employers would do anyway, which we'll get on to. But Train to Gain is less a direct response to a problem of market failure and more a symptom of this same old belief that the best way to boost skills is simply to boost qualification levels, and that if you boost qualification levels, we'll get an immediate productivity reward. As Phil, I did actually agree with quite a few of the things that Phil said, so I will flag up when
Thank you.
just to apologise. As Phil pointed out, this hasn't been borne out in practice. The economy still suffers from skills gaps despite an absolutely massive investment, and there's no clear evidence to suggest that we've seen a productivity reward for the economy as a whole. As with so much else in the skills system, the imperative of hitting narrowly conceived, overly ambitious qualifications targets has skewed the provision which is actually delivered. Training providers target marginal employees. They target those for whom the attainment of qualifications will be terribly easy. And therefore it's not surprising that probably something like 25% of the skills that we're accrediting are existing skills. Around half of employers whose employees receive training said that they would have arranged similar training without public subsidy. And that shouldn't be a surprise to us, given that the pilots of this programme, the employer training pilots, suggested that deadweight was anywhere up to a shocking 100%. The requirement that for the generous public subsidies, the training had to be first full level 2 or level 3 shows us how inflexible the programme is. The priority qualifications, as conceived by government, of course, do not always meet employer needs. 70% of employers said they saw no positive impact on sales, turnover, or profit margins as a result of training. There are a lot of people in government who are still very attached to this scheme and don't want to see it go, but the clear fact is it hasn't worked. The National Audit Office report was particularly damning. They said, quite simply, the programme has not provided good value for money. So what should we do? We believe that government subsidies for on-the-job training should still exist, but the mechanism of train to gain simply isn't the best way to deliver them. So abolish train to gain, do away with the distinction between employer-responsive and adult-responsive funding. This, combined with ditching the government's over-ambitious qualifications targets, should be part of a strategy to radically reduce the government's role in planning skills supply. I'm just going to say a few brief words about sector skills councils. This is another area where Phil was really quite wrong, or rather he was right and wrong. It's very easy actually to kick the sector skills councils. It's very easy to prove that they haven't delivered what they ought to have delivered. But I think that if you're going in for a good kicking, you ought to have a look at what they're expected to deliver and the £4.50 that they're given to deliver it with. Similar systems do actually work extremely well in other countries, but the difference is that sector skills council equivalents in other countries tend to be much, much better funded. From the outset, sector skills councils have been given a bewildering array of objectives. They were given a massive list at the beginning, told to get on with it, and then for good measure the government came back with another new, absolutely massive list of things that they ought to be doing. So we would argue that with minimal budgets, most sector skills councils, I think, have got about 3 million a year, is that right? To deliver them with. We're just expecting far too much. So we think that we should keep sector skills councils, but reduce what they have to deliver and give them more generous budgets to do that with. We think it makes sense for their principal responsibilities to be to engage and advise employers and to help them engage with colleges and providers to tell them what employers really want. And to understand their market and to contribute relevant labour market information, and finally to lead the way on vocational qualifications, albeit if that's just to tell us that a vocational qualification is completely pointless in a certain area. And finally, I just want to say a quick word on apprenticeships. Everybody loves apprenticeships. At their best, apprenticeships can be the highest quality skills training that we have. And of course, they're also a terribly easy sell politically, unlike pretty much everything else in the skills system. Voters have heard of apprenticeships. They think they know what they are. They probably don't really know what they are, but they think they know what they are. But again, the problem with politicians who are in love with apprenticeships is targets. And this is actually one area in which no political party is immune. All political parties want to promise thousands and thousands of new apprenticeships. A general desire to boost apprenticeships is a good thing. But the government's approach should never be about driving up supply and then finding artificially created demand to meet that surplus. Great energy and huge amounts of money should not be spent on foisting apprenticeships upon employers who don't really want them and who will receive no benefit from the scheme. And if we're really committed to worthwhile apprenticeships, why on earth are we bogging down people who run them with endless paperwork? Why are we condemning small employers to hours in a back room filling out forms? And why are we ensuring that popular in-house schemes run by big companies are utterly weighed down by bureaucracy? It's very interesting that Network Rail, for example, which runs an oversubscribed apprenticeship scheme in-house, has to hire somebody full-time just to deal with the government's bureaucracy. So our key message to the government on skills is back off, let go. If you really want a demand-led system, you can't run it all from the centre.
Now finally Diana Kane, who's CEO of the Sector Skills Council, Skills Z, and Deputy Chair of the Alliance of Sector Skills Councils. I'm sure you're going to put a robust defence of these much abused organisations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and hello everybody. And before I start with my robust defence of Sector Skills Councils, I would just like to have a few words about LEACH and to say that whatever we may think about the way in which the agenda's been delivered, which I'll come on to, I think we do have to recognise that he did us all a great service in terms of actually getting skills on the agenda, up the agenda, and getting it recognised as an area that we need to focus on, both economically and societally, if we are going to make sure that we, as a country, survive in the best possible way in a very challenging 21st century. So, back to Sector Skills Councils in my 5 minutes. I wish I'd got more time. I'd love to come back on so many issues, but I am going to focus on the area about how we can maximise our role. Now, Phil, I think it's terribly important as Chair of the Select Committee, that, or previous Chair of the Select Committee, that evidence is what we base our opinions on. I think that's...
Let's hear it.
That's critical. So to your "we are all abject failure" point, I would say to you, palpably on the evidence, not true. I'm very proud to be a Sector Skills Council. I'm very proud of my fellow Sector Skills Councils. Indeed, I would go so far to say that never has so much been delivered by so few with such little resource in the face of a thicket of bureaucracy, and basically with a budgetary situation which I like to describe as one where our pips have already squeaked before we even started. So just as a sort of little picture, that's where I'd start. I would genuinely ask you to read the National Audit Office reports. We've just been combed over very closely by the NAO, all of us in this last period, and I think you'll find that the picture that paints shows some very impressive developments, actually, which I don't have time to go into now. So just quickly, in terms of what we do, well, I think we'd all agree any system, any skill system, however you want to build it, whether it's employer, whether it's individual-led, requires labour market information, requires skills foresight, and requires all of that in order to inform products and planning. So, information, advice and guidance, vital if people are individually going to choose to spend money, or we have a system of learning accounts, requires that information. And so we require standards to inform qualifications, we require standards to inform what goes on within the supply side, and so on and so on. It seems to me that in a global marketplace, it's ever more important that that information is collected sectorally, and it's also collected UK-wide. Mobility of labour increases, employers become more global, they work across borders, even within the UK, so it's a vital building block, and it's our role to provide that. Now, in order to do that, obviously, we have to bring together employers, trade associations, trade unions, and individuals to come together, to share that information, to mutually analyse it, and then to both share it with partners, but really critically, that process means that people come around a set of collective analyses, understandings, and actually start to collectively look at what they need to do to move some of those agendas forward. Vital, because whatever system we adopt, I would argue there is and always will be a need for co-investments in the skills system. So, now, that's another part of what we're supposed to do, but we're also supposed to then make sure that all of the regional and national agencies and further education and higher education are made aware of all of this in order that they can focus what they do. Now, when you consider that we are now in a 4-nation environment in the UK, and when you consider that in England we're in a 9-region environment, then actually all of that starts to mount up enormously in terms of transactional partnership, arrangements and costs. So it's quite a tall order. And of course, as the Policy Exchange report looks at, under the current environment, the number of organisations has multiplied rather than diminished. I actually, and you may well want to debate this, don't put sector skills councils as part of the Quango mix. Again, I think that's another misconception. We are actually industry-led and we are industry-managed, and many of us have industry investment running through our veins as well as public investment. But the other thing, of course, is that we are all very different, and that's why we exist. So we have our labour market information, we use that to work with employers to actually galvanise them around plans and co-investment, and then we have a role in terms of standards development and in promoting qualifications that have currency. Now, in terms of how can we maximise better our role, I would say 4 things. The first is that the LEACH targets, which you've heard much about, are targets which march the economy, both sectorally and indeed geographically, to the beat of the same drum. Of course, they play a role in terms of sense of measurement, but they have skewed the system. And at the end of the day, basically, they become fairly meaningless. I mean, if you look at my sector, I cover the media. You know, we have over 30% freelancers, we have 50% who basically employ between 1 to 4 people, 96% of employers employ under 50, over 50% of our workforce is already at higher education level. You know, it seems to me to then apply the LEACH targets to our particular sector analyses doesn't make sense. Actually, what we need to be doing, my sector happens to be in a growth area of the economy, is we need to be looking at that information and saying, what then do we agree should be the relevant targets that we are aiming for? And that they may be measured in a number of ways, not just via qualifications. I think the second thing is, in terms of the role that we have in relation to informing all those many, many parts of intermediary bodies that then are supposed to invest the money to deliver to the demand side, we really don't have any joined up narrative. It doesn't matter how many white papers come out, there is still not one script. I actually sit on the London Skills and Employment Board, and I was very struck by their briefing the other day on the white paper, and indeed East Midlands Development Agency. If you look at those, their analysis is perfectly great. It just completely fails to mention the role that Sector Skills Council have got and where we're supposed to play into the system. And I would say probably the other way around. If you take some sectoral analyses, you'll probably think, oh, where are the regions in that? So where is the script? Where is the actually more detailed direction of how we're supposed to be working together? Not there. So, you know, not only do we have complexity, but we don't even have clarity about what's expected through that complexity. The third point is investment, and I'll just give you one example in terms of qualifications actually at the moment. So we're supposed to be reforming qualifications. Our grants this year to maintain and develop standards on which all of the qualification structure is based are £120,000 each for the whole of the UK. Reform a system on the basis of that. And then finally, again, we look at further and higher education. Now, further education obviously has the ability to have a systemic address in terms of informing supply side. Higher education, much more complicated. Obviously, a number, 100 and whatever it is in England, leave aside the Celtic nations, individual institutions awarding their own qualifications, and therefore the ability to then broker through with them becomes more complex. I do agree, however, with other speakers that whilst, I mean, not just machines to deliver skills, obviously academically very important. They need to be played in more effectively, and the Lib Dem position on one agency, I think, is something that would be very welcome. So, in summation, NAO reports, the role of Sector Skills Council, I think is critical. Brokerage is critical. I'll give you one more example from my sector, which is interesting in relation to Alison's points about individuals. At the moment, there are 8,306 courses delivered and supported by the public purse, which are for the media. 1,378 of those are undergraduate, 700 are postgraduate. There are 100,000 students in higher education pursuing media courses at the moment. Obviously, some of them are humanities-based, others are more vocationally based. And I have to say that employment from those courses is good anyway. However, if you assume that a lot of those individuals are, as it were, spending their money on actually thinking that they want to move on and work in a career in the media, then actually you have to question whether or not they have spent that money wisely and whether that provision has delivered what our industry needs to take it forward in terms of its competitiveness and productivity. And I think the answer to that is probably no. Our role then is to broker in the middle of that system. I won't bore you with what we've done and how, but I would say it's that triangular relationship between employer, between individual, and between the state that needs to be managed. It needs to be differentiated. It needs to be able to move, not all at the same time, but in different ways, at different times. And I think if we can achieve that, if I was Minister for Skills, that would be what I would want to see, then I think we do have an ability to actually ensure that skills as part of a broader economic development agenda and is taken in relation to an analysis of industries that aren't just about skills, but are about the whole picture, is the way forward. Thank you.
In a second, just to say, if at the back you can't hear us, if you could pipe up. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Good. I'll just start with one question for Phil, actually. Am I right in thinking, Phil, that you would make it compulsory that listed companies would have to put in their annual accounts what they were doing about skills?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say I'm speaking for myself and not the Lib Dem.
Yes.
Because I'm retiring soon, so I can say what I
Do what you like.
I think I actually don't think that companies get sufficient recognition for the phenomenal work that many do in terms of actually supporting and developing skills. And I think that it's actually, when you look at some of the nonsense which companies have to report in their annual accounts, not to be able to report on the way in which they develop the skills of their workforce, which I think is a huge selling point for a company. And you mentioned Railtrack, you mentioned Rolls-Royce, BAE Systems, all in fact put that very, very high up in terms of their priority. And I think that we should be encouraging all companies to do that.
Do you think it should be compulsory?
Yes, I do actually, yes. I think it's...
Isn't that rather a statist approach which contradicts your comments on Sector Skills Council?
Well, I'd get rid of the Sector Skills Council, as you know. That's I've made that sort of quite clear, because I think Anna's absolutely right. Unless you actually fund them properly to do a job, and you have them industry-led and not led by the government, then quite frankly, I think they're neither fish nor fowl. But in terms of status, I think it is important that there are certain things which you would expect public companies to be able to report in their annual accounts. And I think that actually reporting in terms of the skills development of their workforce is something which, yes, I think is worth putting in.
Right, okay, let's have some nice questions from...
Well, can I just say while people are thinking of questions, I was much maligned about Leach. He's a lovely man. And,
I should probably put that if Lord Leach is actually here, you should probably have a right to reply.
No, yeah. But his analysis was absolutely crucial at that time to actually look at what the skills needs of the nation were. It is the way in which it was picked up in terms of the target-led culture which actually did great disservice to Leach, but his analysis I thought was spot on.
That was not the
He's
final
a good old
word,
man. He was a wonderful man.
So we're going to have some questions for Phil. We'll keep talking. Gentleman in the front. If you could identify who you are, where you're from as well.
Ian Hayes, UK Things of Science.
Oh, do we have a microphone coming round?
One should be coming.
Maybe if I turn round. You'll go with me, won't you? What I was interested in is, if you give the power to the individual, how do you make sure that the individuals do the things that the country broadly needs? And I say that in the context of languages in school, foreign languages in schools almost disappearing, more students wanting to do psychology than biology, chemistry and physics and all the other subjects in science in universities, the absolute enormous expansion in performing arts due to all kinds of things which we won't get into now. So how do you make the individual choose appropriate things, not directing them absolutely, but appropriate things for the country's future?
If I could ask Alison about that first, because this to me is an economic problem too, rationalism.
Right, it is. I said when I was standing at the podium that individuals are better at knowing what they need than anybody else is, and I really hold to that. That doesn't mean they're perfect, but they're better. And I'm quite glad you brought up languages, because it's a very interesting example. Languages have basically been wiped out in post-compulsory education because they're leisure. They have no, as far as the skills target's concerned, they're horrible things. Get rid of them, get rid of them. Jim Knight actually stood up and attacked David Willits in the House for the idea that public money might go to support adults who might be learning French because they thought they wanted to go on holiday there. So I think what I'd like to come back to you on is not how do you create utopia, but of the systems that we've looked at, giving money to individuals versus the government deciding what is good for individuals and good for the country. I think the jury is no longer out. We've had a go at deciding what is good for people. And the qualifications which we got as a result, as compared to those of 30 years ago, are visibly not doing anything for people's incomes, which I suggest means they're probably not doing much for the economy either. You do need information, you do need to regulate and license institutions and awarding bodies with a light touch. But that's no different in a sense from what you do with anything else. We have food hygiene laws, we have all sorts of things. But it does seem to me that what you have to start from is not an ideal that we can't reach, but which of the systems that's on offer is likely to do better.
Would you like to make a comment about it's an interesting contradiction in a way, isn't it? How do you make people choose the right things on their own?
I actually think it's a fantastic question, because it's an issue that we actually have the Science Committee, as you know, in the House now. It's one of the things that's really very much at the heart of our agenda. How do actually do we get? And I don't agree with this business that the nation does not in fact have an obligation to be able to develop the skills, which are generic skills, which you actually need in order to apply. And I think it is really sort of getting a balance. It's also making sure that in terms of institutions, to which inevitably the individual will go to actually purchase what they want, is in fact to incentivise the institutions to actually make them much more attractive. And you can't make science, for instance, the hard science, the physical science, attractive at a 1.7 premium in terms of teaching. It just cannot be done to that high quality. And once it's high quality, and you actually start to see the rewards, and this is what about guidance is about, you then, I think, start to get a real sort of dialogue between an individual, an institution, and indeed their future economic needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think signposting is key. I think information for individuals, advice and guidance, but then I think the relationship is one where, in my sector, obviously a plethora of choices to be made. Our responsibility is to bring our industry together, to recognise certain centres of excellence, to then make sure we're focusing equipment sponsorship, work placements, links with the industry on those centres, and in that way signpost them, brand them, and to a degree then it seems to me that there's an ability to actually guide individuals through and for those centres to start to actually grow, whereas some of the others might then diminish. But it's a complex question. But it needs brokers, industry-led sector skills.
Absolutely. You're going to look at this, but clearly the Tories have recently proposed taking teenage careers advice away from connections, which gets a pretty bad press for it. I don't know if that would be one solution, or if you have any other solutions.
Yeah, well, advice is clearly key. I was going to just sort of follow on from the information point and say I don't think that it's probably enough to incentivise FE providers to provide information. If you watch what's happening in the AT sector at the moment, they're being lent on to provide information information about outcomes for students, and they just don't want to do it. So I think the message has to be police yourselves, or the government will sort of step in and do it. And that sort of counters, someone was saying to me earlier from UKCES that there's often an irritating argument made that information is far too nuanced and can't be put in the public domain. But I think that providers probably need to realise that if they don't take responsibility for this agenda, somebody else will just publish the information about you anyway, and it will be a downside less favourable. But I also think that employers need to take a bit more ownership of these sorts of issues. Phil's committee looked at forensic science as an example. I mean, that happens mostly within higher education, but there are thousands and thousands of kids studying forensic science degrees, and employers don't want them. They'll take a chemistry student instead, because forensic science degrees tend to have no science in them. But employers aren't actually, why aren't employers telling students that that's the case? I mean, that message has got to come partly from the institutions, but partly from employers as well.
Right, I think we'll take a couple of questions at a time. The gentleman in front of the pot plant, if you're ready very patiently, and perhaps if you first, and then we'll take this lady here. Question, please. And if you say who you are as well.
Thank you very much. My name is David Braham.
What organisation are you from?
I'm not from an organisation. Two quick questions. Firstly, you mentioned the success of certain big organisations, whether it's BAE and Boeing or whether it's Ernst & Young. Is there much linkage between big business and small business when delivering skills, and is this something that the Learning and Skills Councils and Set Skills Councils can help out with in the more so? But also, you've not mentioned our professional qualifications, whether it's accounting qualifications or legal qualifications or things like that, where the system there delivered that. Can this be brought out more across other sectors, and can qualifications like the ACA or the ACCA be used for other uses?
I had a question which picks up on.
Can you say?
My name is Jenny Ross. I'm from Ingis, which is a welfare to work provider.
Right.
So my question is a bit around the labour market information side and the advice side, because I think a lot of the focus today has been more broadly on skills, but people who are unemployed have particular problems in accessing good quality skills provision. And at the moment, the welfare to work sector is increasingly targeted on sustained employment outcomes. So we don't have this nervousness. All of our figures, all of our payments are linked to whether we can place people up into sustainable jobs. And I just wondered, in terms of alignment of funding, targets, etc., for people who are long-term unemployed at the moment, the system isn't meeting their needs, and whether the panel could reflect on that.
Right. Okay, perhaps Phil first, because you've looked at NEETs, which in a way ties in with this, and addressed the question.
I mean, my worry, which I tried to sort of mention if I was actually the minister, is that I think we're dealing with two different silos here. You know, the idea that we're actually, in terms of Job Centre Plus and their budget, which are huge budgets and are going to grow, actually have skills components within that, which are aimed at specific short-term targets. And that's how you basically get paid. That's how you judge success. And then you have the longer term in terms of train to gain, which is business-led, coming out of another part. And what we need to do is to actually bring those two together. But in terms of sustainable employment, it often requires a different skills approach in terms of being able to provide the generic under skills which enable them to go into a plethora of different businesses and then grow their skills. Sorry, but everything has got to be limited to particular packages. If you don't fit into that package, well, goodbye.
If you could just address the gentleman's point about how large businesses can help small businesses.
Well, I don't think the sector skills councils have succeeded in brokering that at all. I'm just trying to be argumentative.
There's a theme emerging here, don't you think?
No. But I think that there is a. I think what is interesting, if you look, for instance, in the East Midlands, you look at Rolls-Royce, and you actually look at the way in which they interplay with their suppliers. What you actually do see is that skills agenda runs right through them and right through their employers. Why? Because the products which they are receiving as components to their business have got to be of the relevant sort of quality, so they take an interest. And I do think that one of the things which the sector skills councils could have done much more effectively, and to be fair, some have done reasonably well, particularly in engineering, is that interrelationship in terms of the supply chain, and to actually make sure that quality in terms of product requires high levels of skill, and everybody has an investment in that. So a better way, rather than simply saying the government should organise it from the centre.
I'm just looking to Tom in the audience who co-authored our report to correct me if I get the country wrong. No, but I think that we, our research found that in Hong Kong, am I right on Hong Kong, that there are flagship employers, and if they have a particularly brilliant training scheme, then they'll receive some cash to make sure that they're showing other people in the system what they did and how they did it. And I wonder if that's something that we might learn from. And on the unemployment question, I mean, I think it's quite a nice route into basic skills. And I think that the government obviously spends a hell of a lot of money on basic skills, about 600 million. And I think that's very worthwhile, but it's got, as usual, tangled up in all sorts of messy assumptions, namely that basic skills will drive up productivity when in fact they probably won't. And I think because we're focusing just on that, we're not focusing on the stuff that actually would help individuals achieve what they need to achieve. And I think we ought to be thinking a lot more about the quality of the teaching that's available and the sort of courses that you can do if you need to advance your literacy or numeracy, for example. So why should you have to have some crappy short course? Shouldn't we provide you something that's more intensive and longer and more worthwhile?
I know that Alison wants to talk about basic skills, which is something she's researching in, but first of all, Dinah, let's see if you could address a specific point about how large businesses can help small businesses.
Well, I think there are many examples of that taking place within the Sector Skills Council network, and I think that in many ways the best way of managing those supply chain relationships has to be on that sectoral basis. So, for example, energy and utility skills, which now has a very close relationship with the regulator in terms of investment from those companies into skills to support the National Skills Academy, which then supports obviously individuals, but also supports smaller companies who they then are also looking at in relation to supply chain contracts between the big employers and small employers. My own sector, S4C, when it commissions independent producers, it has requirements for them to actually outline their plans and skills, to undertake a skills audit, and to basically dock into provision that's available once they've analysed those needs. And I could go on and on and on. Suffice to say, there are many and varied examples. And I think, I mean, the other thing just is that, relatively speaking, in relation to the many and varied parts of the skills system that have existed for some time, the SSC network is still relatively young and actually hasn't had that much time to get its feet under the table. These kinds of cultural and systemic changes in terms of actually getting employers to look at these issues in a more holistic way does take time, and I think the fruits of that are being delivered at the moment, if you would look again, and I'm happy to give that evidence to you. And I think, therefore, you shouldn't cut down trees just as they're about to bear fruit.
That's probably quite an apposite point for skills in general, because clearly every organisation is renamed at least twice a year on the dot, and then renamed 3 times when the next government comes in. Perhaps if you could outline a bit your findings on basic skills, would be very interesting.
Yes, I will, though. I should say that we've just finished doing a very large study of what happened to people who were on basic skills courses in the workplace, of which the outcomes were not altogether happy, I have to say. But it does relate very much to this issue with long-term unemployed. You're probably well aware that one of the things that's been tried over the last few years is forcing people to go on basic skills courses as part of trying to get them back into work. And essentially, it doesn't work. Never mind, essentially, it doesn't work. One of the reasons it doesn't work is because, partly because it gets hung up on this sort of short courses, stick a certificate, meet the targets. It also doesn't work because people learn effectively when they can see the point of it. And one of the things that came out of this big study that we did actually was some very clear differences in whether or not people were essentially forced learners who were sort of put on these courses by their employers, or whether they'd actually chosen to go into them. And unfortunately, in this case, it came out just like the learning theory tells you it ought to. And if you're a forced learner, you don't learn, and if you aren't a forced learner, you do. But one of the things that, again, I think is very relevant is that what we know about employment is that the best thing for people who are unemployed is to have a job. You know, that's the best predictor of getting one in the future. It's one of the things we can actually say. Evidence-based policy is right there. Sending people on courses to be trained on the idea that they will somehow get skills and then they'll go out and get a better job is just not the case. And I realise I'm starting to sound like one of these old records, but what is also clear is that a lot of people, once they're in jobs, there are things they want to learn, and they may not be things that are directly related to their job now, but they're things to do with them thinking about their futures. And many people who are long-time unemployed do want to improve their skills, and they do want to learn to do things. They want to improve their writing. And one of the things which I think the current system, for a variety of reasons, the silos is one, the qualification targets is another, the sort of obsession with the immediate business relevance, post-business relevance of skills is a third. It actually serves people like this particularly badly. They get hit with a sort of triple whammy on that. So basic skills is actually extraordinarily important. It takes years, you know, we go to school for a decade. Why we think that, you know, putting people on a 30-hour course in basic skills is doing anything for anybody is beyond me.
Right, the gentleman here, waiting patiently, and the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Jim Association of Colleges. Phil mentioned the public spending pressures that are going to be on, and the colleges, my organisation represents, are already taking £200 million hit this year, partly because the government has preserved the expenditure on the sort of national apparatus, including skills councils. And I wondered, the Leach report very clearly sets out the fact that we need to be more educated in the future to compete better. And I wondered what the panel thought that should be done to encourage, if government has got the money to spend more in the next few years, as we know it hasn't, what can be done to encourage individuals and employers to spend more?
Chris Sims from the City and Guild Centre for Skills Development. My question is mainly for Professor Wolf in the light of what you were just saying about forced learners. Given what you just said, and I know your views on the subject, is it possible that the raising the participation age can actually be harnessed through complementary policy measures to actually have the desired impact on skill levels, or is it simply a deemed policy?
Clearly, Alan, better answer the questions first.
Okay, well, at least I wrote that part for you guys, didn't I? I think that the second thing I would do if I were minister for a day is save the money that's being wasted on trying to push people into education at 17 if they don't want to be there, and let them come back when they want to. So yes, I hadn't actually even been thinking about the raising the school leaving age when I said that. I do think very much that that's actually a really important thing for anybody thinking about policy, anybody thinking about what we should do, is the fact that actually people, the learner does the learning. Not the person sort of standing there, not the person writing the check, not the person setting the target. So if people are going to learn anything, they have to want to learn, and they have to see the point of it. And so I am still completely opposed to forcing people to stay if they don't want to. They should be able to bank the money and use it when they want it. But I suppose I also do think that things are taking a hit. FE is taking a hit. I was talking to a friend of mine who runs an adult college. She's been making people redundant already. The SAG is taking a hit. I think that there is enormous potential for saving in apparatus. I think, you know, I have not talked about skills councils because I've got Phil Douglas work for me, but I have to say I am basically Phil on this. It's crazy. There are 60 million people in this country. The idea that we can run skills policy or education policy tightly through this apparatus is crazy. And I just think that we could save a lot of money and put it back into actually making it possible for education.
Should we go on to Phil next if you could address this? The issue of the school leaving age, I think, is quite interesting. And then also, do you think that it is possible to get employers to pay more?
I think in terms of the school leaving age, the government's aspiration that people should actually stay and continue throughout their life of actually getting into the habit of improving their education and training must be a good thing. I actually think I don't think anybody would go from that. I think the idea of simply raising the school leaving age, which seemed to be a very cynical way of actually massaging all sorts of other figures, which seemed to be behind it, was something which I thought sent out all the wrong signals what we should be doing is making it the sort of system that the middle classes aspire to, and which we want everyone to aspire to continue to invest in yourself. In terms of getting employers to fund more, I don't think you'll do that. I mean, there was a disagreement with my idea that employers should get tax breaks for their training and development. I mean, clearly you would need to have a system whereby that wasn't just simply producing masses of deadweight costs, as we've seen particularly with the apprenticeship system in many large firms that simply rebadging their work to get the grants. But I actually do think that there are many employers who, if we just check as an example the Olympic Park and the work that John Arnott's doing there in terms of the legacy of the Olympic Park, and actually creating a wherewithal to move that workforce on into, for instance, into Crossrail and the massive projects that are going up there, that I think is really sort of employers, and it is a tax on all those employers, enabled to be able to sort of develop the skills of that workforce and then not lose those skills as they move on to other projects. So I think that there are lots of devices, and incentivising that through sensible tax breaks seems to be something which we ought to do. But can I just return to the question about the FE divide? Because I think that whilst we've had a significant investment in FE during the last 10 years, I wouldn't deny that, despite the debacle of the capital programme going wrong, I think that the FE sector is starting to emerge as being really the sort of engine room of the skills, you know, particularly around the sort of level 3 skills. And I'm very much concerned about the level 3, level 4 skills as much as I am about the basic skills. Because that's what will effectively drive our economy post-recession. And it's amazing to me that we have a relatively small hit on higher education, and suddenly we're talking about going back 800 years, and this is the end of the universe. And yet a significantly greater decrease in FE spending has not raised a squeak in the House of Commons at all. And there is a real need to actually align, I think, FE and HE together and start to recognise that that whole budget pulled together has got to be used more effectively. And the idea that we can simply hide behind university autonomy is something which I think we've really got to address, rather than just simply say we take that as a given.
Yes, I mean, I love discussions about skills system, actually, because what you always find is that any given part will always point the finger at the other parts and say that's where all the bureaucratic waste is. I do think that as a whole there is a significant amount of investment made in skills, and I think that you know, there are issues around driving, as you say, efficiencies through the supply side part of the skills system as well as elsewhere. And I would agree, again, with Phil, that actually looking at, as they have in Scotland, bringing FE and HE funding together in one place is a sensible thing to do. But just going back to, because I feel I have to, I've been placed in the position of the defender of the SSEs. I mean, to reiterate, £48 million of investment out of the billions that are made in skills. Work that we've just done with Baker Tilly looking at the impact of that in relation to the leverage that we achieve is at the moment, in terms of efficiency, in terms of helping the public money that's in the system be spent more effectively and in ways that deliver better to employers and individuals, then you're looking at about 100 to 130 million of added benefit from the 3 to 4 million that's being invested. And that's before we start looking at what we're doing in terms of raising employer co-investment, which is significant. And you know, again, I can sit here and I can run through all the various levies we've got in place in our industries as a result of our work and what we've done to broker that investment to the table, and so can every other sector skills council. So do not assume that that investment is dead weight investment, and do not assume that 48 million is going to break the bank in terms of whether we were here or not, because it isn't. You'd still have a lot to sort out whether we're there or not.
So if you have questions for Dinah afterwards, you're very robust defender.
You spotted that.
I'm just going to make a 30-second response, which is that I think the Phil's committee, when they did a report looking at skills, tried to put together a chart which mapped all of the different skills organisations. and it's bloody impossible. So there must be some savings out there from the crime-ocracy, there just must be. And sector skills councils, even if you're after their budget, I did make the point earlier, it's a titchy one. So you're not going to save the sector by just axing sector skills councils anyway. And coming back to how do we encourage individuals to invest more, it comes back to Alison's point that she made about school leaving age, which is that learners have got to see the point of it. So it's got to be about information again.
Right, thank you very much. I'm very glad, very relieved we got the crime-ocracy in right at the end. We're finished. We need to just finish at 2 o'clock on the dot. So finally, if you could just give last thanks to the speakers, and clearly afterwards, if they have time, we also perhaps approach them one-to-one and ask some questions. Thank you very much.